Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Flight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a fantastic show for you this evening. Dr. Susan Northrup, the FAA's Federal Air Surgeon, is here this evening. So it's going to be a really great show hearing about her background and history, so many wonderful things that have brought her to this position, and also what's going on at the FAA, past, present, and future when it comes to aeromedical. Now, before we get started, as always, a few housekeeping notes. Tonight's broadcast will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. Just do a search on Social Flight, one word, Social Flight on YouTube, and that'll get you to this as well as all of our other shows. In addition, be sure to check out socialflight.com and the free Social Flight mobile apps for Apple and Android devices. We have tens of thousands of aviation events, destinations, $100 hamburgers, you name it, it's all in there. And as part of that, you also have with our mobile app, the Fly to Win Challenge. All you need to do is get the app, go fly, check in at an airport. You are automatically entered into all of the different prize drawings that we have on a rolling basis. And we just selected our winner of our Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset. We won't be naming that person this evening because we need to hear back from them, but we've picked our winner for that, and we now have a competition going on at the moment for a Tempest Aero prize pack. For all of you that own or work on aircraft, this is a huge set of things from Tempest Aero, just some wonderful things. So with that, I would like to begin our program. Dr. Susan Northrup is the FAA's Federal Air Surgeon. She is responsible for the direction and management of all FAA medical programs, from policy to aerospace, medical, and human factors research to what is probably the top priority for many of tonight's viewers, of course, airman certification. Dr. Northrup's a retired U.S. Air Force colonel who's previously headed up the United States Delegation to NATO's aeromedical working group, or worked as part of that. She's also an active private pilot with a passion for general aviation. She lives on an airpark and flies her stunning Stearman and the Canadian version of the T6 Texan, the T6 Harvard. Let me bring her on now. I'm thrilled to have her here tonight to learn about her personal story and her thoughts on the future of aviation medicine. Please welcome Dr. Susan Northrup. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Your story I found so compelling. I mean, the accomplishments, there's so many things in your bio that I couldn't even begin to read it all and not take up half of the program. So tell us how it started. How did you come into medicine and aviation? What are the connections here?
Well, so I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. In fact, from my bedroom window, I could see the end of the runway at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So I sort of ended, there it is. It's right there. And of course, growing up in Dayton, Ohio, you get told all of the Wright brothers stuff. So I used to play on Huffman Prairie. We used to run along the top of the dam there and roll down the hill. And I remember from a very early age learning all about the Wright brothers and going to see the early Wright flyers and any museum they could take you to. I still remember when the Air Force Museum was in Hangar 1 as opposed to the beautiful location it is now. Sort of a foregone conclusion, but then my life took a bit of a turn and I got really interested in the arts. So I was a professional ballerina as a teenager. And I was interviewed at one point by for a teacher's magazine in the county where we lived. And she asked me a rather telling question. It's like, well, Susan, what would you do if you couldn't dance? I'm 16 years old, just got back from New York City, been on a scholarship at the Joffrey School, and I'm thinking ballet, I'm going here. And she asked me this question, and she let me think about it for a few minutes. And it felt like an eternity because you want to have these answers right away when somebody interviews you. So I said, well, a bunch of the dancers are getting hurt right now. So maybe if I couldn't dance, I'd become a doctor and teach my fellow dancers, good technique, proper warm-ups, the right equipment, and they wouldn't get hurt quite as often. So fast forward about a year, and I hurt a knee, and my parents moved to DC. And here I am in now Springfield, Ohio, going, how am I going to afford this? So there's an adage in ballet that 1 day off, you know it, 2 days off, your teacher knows it, 3 days off, your audience knows it. And it's like, okay, plan number 2, let's look at medical school.
How old were you at that point?
17. Yeah,
Wow.
dancers start young. So off I go to college. And in my family, you had to pay for part of your schooling. Didn't matter how you paid for it. Could be scholarships, could be earning, a part-time job or whatever. So I saved my pennies, and about halfway through my sophomore year, I looked at my bank account and went, oh my. And graduate school was on your own. So I thought, I'm going to go talk to the Air Force. So off I went to the ROTC detachment there at Ohio State and said, what have you got for me? And they said, we got a live one. We've got something for you. And it's this thing called a pre-health profession scholarship program. Okay, I'm in. They grant 25 a year. I was lucky enough to get one, but it was ROTC for the last 2 years of college and a scholarship for medical school if you kept your grades up and your nose clean. Well, between the junior and senior year of college, they sent us off to this thing called Operation Air Force, 3rd Lieutenant's program. So off I go. At Shaw Air Force Base, they got F-16s and RF-4s and U-2s and CH-53s. And I'm going, well, this is cool. And then they said, you're interested in aviation and medicine? You need to spend some time with a flight surgeon. So off I went. And these guys got to fly 4 hours a month. Had to. Their flight
Really?
pay. Oh, yeah. And I went, well, I'll be darned. So as I said, my interest in medicine was from a preventive point of view. And there aren't many people that are more athletic really than pilots, certainly fighter pilots, because you got to be fit. You got to be able to pull those G's. And I fell in love with it. I had my first tactical sortie in an O2. And then I got a CH-53 ride. But I didn't get an F-16 ride that time because the Academy cadets got precedent over the ROTC cadets, particularly the ones going to medical school, not going to pilot training. But from there, it was just a love affair. I mean, when the interest in medicine is prevention, you do things a little differently. So as a flight surgeon, my goal is to keep as many people flying as possible, as safely as possible. And quite frankly, pilots are very motivated to stay in the air. So there's a fighting chance they might actually do what the doctor suggests, even though there's a bit of a love-hate relationship sometimes. I get that. But let's see, finished my medical school, did a year of internship in family practice, and the Air Force said, hey, remember us? No, yeah, you guys.
You still owe
and I'd
us.
already taken, you still owe us, yeah. And at that point, I owed them 8 years, not including any time I spent in training. But they said, we have a deal for you. We're going to send you to the 69th Fighter Squadron at Moody Air Force Base. F-16s? You're going to let me be a flight surgeon in F-16s? Oh, how cool is that? So spent 3 years at Moody and then went back to my residencies. I am board certified in aerospace medicine and occupational medicine. I also have a master's of public health as part of that training program. And I've been in aerospace medicine ever since.
Wow. That's amazing. So you must have gotten, well, certainly in there as part of that, you got to fly a number of aircraft, it sounds like. You got your training that way, and that's an interesting perspective that you just said on your approach to medicine, coming from a perspective of prevention. It seems like, I think that perhaps the general perception of the aeromedical system that we have today of going to your AME for just kind of as a gateway to your medical is kind of the end of the chain as opposed to the beginning of the chain of that. What do you think can connect those things to be thinking more ahead of time of that prevention and what you do to stay healthy instead of it just being that check at the end of whether or not you're getting your medical?
So it starts at the very youngest ages. I mean, we really need to be, I mean, you look at the things that are plaguing the United States citizens today: obesity, diabetes, heart disease. A lot of that starts at very young ages, where we need to be educating people in elementary and middle school and right on through, so that healthy habits are there.
Hmm.
And one of the main reasons we do medical exams is to try to identify things early before they become an issue. So hopefully we'll find the things like, the blood pressure slightly up, or
Hmm.
there's a little bit of sugar in the urine, or we do an EKG and see something before there's, major heart damage.
Hmm.
But when you look at what the medical is, it's really a bet that the pilot is going to not become subtly or suddenly incapacitated for the duration of the certificate.
Hmm.
It's a bit like an insurance program. So you buy insurance just in case you die, your family gets paid off. They sell you insurance because they expect you to live and they're going to keep your money.
Right.
So we're kind of doing the same thing. So if somebody has a time limited certificate, it just means we want to look at them a little more closely to be sure that the bet that they're not going to become suddenly or subtly incapacitated still is good.
That makes sense. Definitely. Now, before we get too much into that side of kind of policy and the rest of it, I also want to continue on your story and understand how you then moved from the military side, and then of course there's your role you played in the, as we mentioned earlier, in NATO's aeromedical working group, to rising to the level that you're at right now.
Interesting course I've had. I've been very fortunate. So in the military, I did a chief of aerospace medicine job at Pope Air Force Base. Unfortunately, I did not fly F-16s there because as I drove on base, the last one took off. But I learned all about C-130s, a little bit about A-10s. They don't have a backseat. But C-130s are pretty doggone awesome too. There was a pretty strong special ops group at Pope Air Force Base as well. I went from there to Bolling Air Force Base. I was the chief of operational medicine for the Air Force, and that's where I did the NATO work. And the NATO work, I was able to meet all kinds of interesting people from all of the NATO countries and the Partners for Peace. And the goal of that group was to standardize the Air Forces enough so that they could talk to each other on the radios, they could use common language, air traffic control would be similar. From a medical point of view, if you were injured in the field, the litter would work, and nominally the Army's helicopters, the French dust-offs, and the U.S. planes back to the U.S., back to the States, so that you didn't have to change litters. Everything
Mm.
worked through the system. A fair amount of standardization of cockpit design work, human factors, met world-renowned experts from all over doing that work. There was a similar group called the Air Standardization Coordinating Committee, which is the English-speaking air forces. And that group was even tighter. So I was the coordinating member for that for the US and head of delegation for the NATO group. Lots of contacts all over the world. So after my first child was born and then I was pregnant with child number 2, I had one of those life contemplation moments, if you will, when service before self became a challenge. It's easy when you've got one. Children, if you have them, are exponential. It's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 4 when it comes to the work. And yeah, I was married to a professional pilot at that point, and one of us needed to be near the boys. So I left the active duty and went to the Reserve Command and took a job at Delta Airlines, where I was the regional director for aircrew and passenger health services, which on the Delta side meant I was the white hat. So I was working with the pilots and getting their packages together, submitting them to the FAA, getting them in the air as quickly as we possibly could. And then the airline industry took a downturn, and doctors are expensive. And almost every airline got rid of their medical departments.
Oh, wow.
I was unemployed for 4 whole days. And I went back active duty in the Reserve Command, running their line of duty board, workman's comp, if you will, for the reserve folks. And I heard about this job offer or job opening at the Southern region for the FAA. as the regional flight surgeon. So I applied and was selected, started in April of 2007, which interestingly enough was the same time frame I was selected as a director of the American Board of Preventive Medicine. Slightly different story. But the southern region, certain other areas of the country like to say everything's bigger there. Nah, it's bigger in southern region when it comes to the FAA. We had between 24 and 25% of all applications for medicals were performed in the southern region year over year.
Really?
We had 20%. Yeah. Well, think about it. Good weather down here. We had 20% of all the aviation medical examiners, almost a third of the air traffic controllers. So we were busy, really busy. And then after about 11 years, I was selected as the senior regional flight surgeon, which meant I had operational oversight of all of the regions. And one of my major goals for that was making sure that we had standardized, or at least if you had a case and you went to one regional flight surgeon, you got a similar answer from another regional flight surgeon. And that was rather intriguing as we tried to standardize within the art of medicine, because there's gray areas in medicine without a doubt. But similar cases should get similar answers. And then COVID hit. And I imagine we'll talk more about COVID, but making sure that the operation of aerospace medicine within the FAA was consistent with keeping the national airspace safe and open was a huge task over the last year and a half. I got to do more international work with ICAO. There's an ICAO manual called Testing and Cross-Border Risk Mitigation Management, which was a jointly developed document trying to ensure people felt more comfortable and that we had the right measures in place to stop infections in the air. Because of course, from a public health viewpoint, you're interested in not only the potential transmission of the infection on board an aircraft, but you don't want to translocate the disease from one country that might have a higher rate to a country with a lower rate.
Right.
So we did a lot of work on that. I was one of the primary editors to try to make sure that that was there. And that got me involved in the CART, which is the Council's Aviation Return Task Force. There it is, Recovery Task Force. So it's a huge ICAO effort to make sure that we get some borders back open and people back traveling as safely as we possibly can. And that led to the Runway to Recovery, which was the US document associated with that. And then I got lucky enough. I applied, interviewed, and was selected. I started January 17th of this year.
Wow.
We've been having a great time ever since. At least I've been having a good time.
I mean, it's a fascinating role, of course, that you're in. Now, I like the fact that in your story, of course, you mentioned that when you were with Delta, you were on the other side of the equation, trying to keep their pilots flying, dealing with issues and submitting things to the FAA, ostensibly getting as many of their pilots, in the air and making sure that any issues that came up on their medicals were kind of you were advocating, I assume, on their behalf.
Yes.
During their time of working with the FAA prior to being at the head of this part of aerospace medical, what have you seen change? I mean, how have you seen things evolve during your time in that area?
Wow, if you just look at the last 10 years, there have been some amazing things happening in aerospace medicine. Prior to about that time frame, almost every decision had to be made by the FAA for any deferred or denied airman medical certificate application. And we came out with something called an AME Assisted Special Issuance, AASI, where we, the FAA, would review it once, and then for the subsequent years, providing the airman provided all the information that was in their letter, the AME could issue and then submit the information to us for review. And that sped up the process. Because let's face it, an airman with a certificate in his pocket is a happy one.
Right. So that's more of a check and balance type thing where you're saying that, is it only, is it listed that there are kind of certain conditions, certain circumstances where then the AME
Yes.
is empowered to do that? They make a case they believe they can stand behind, they issue, and then they
Right.
submit it to you for review. Did I get that correct?
Yes, and a lot of this is explained in the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners. It's available online. If you Google AME Guide, it's one of the first ones that pop up, and any airman or doctor can go in there and look at what we're looking for and what we
That's pretty
require.
important in itself, the idea that
Right.
I think education is key in this, and we have to be, as pilots, we have to be advocates first and foremost for ourselves, and then armed with that information, we then go to the next level of seeing if our physicians that are treating us can be our advocates where they're comfortable, and then same thing, you're trying to get your AME to be your advocate as well then and build your case if you're having any challenges. Does that make
Right.
sense? Is that the right way to approach
Yeah,
that?
that's exactly the way I would approach it. So the next thing, there were a couple other things. So 10 years ago, it caused quite the furor in certain arenas. We began to allow pilots to fly on one of 4 serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, for depression.
Mm-hmm.
That was huge, and we now have 10 years of track record, and we're reviewing the procedures now so that we can evaluate what we're doing to determine if it's the right mix of things, or can we relax some of the requirements to
Mm-hmm.
get even more people in the air.
So
We're
that,
beginning to look. Go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
So we're beginning to look at mixed diagnoses with those medications as well. So fingers crossed, we'll find a sweet spot there. The next big thing that came out was a process called conditions AMEs can issue, or CACIs. So before we did this, anybody with hypertension had to come through the FAA. And now with these CACIs, if they meet the requirements, the AME can issue. They're not on a special issuance. It doesn't have to come to us. We can ask questions about things, but the actual paperwork, unless we're asking questions or something else happens, it stays with the AME.
Right.
There are checklists for that in the AME guide for each of those conditions, and there's 23 of them, I believe, at the present time, and we're looking at 2 more. So we're trying to get as much of the, vanilla, that's probably not a great term, but the usual customary, we've got a great track record with it. We know how people act. We know how people respond to these medications and the safety parameters to it. We're trying to push those decisions out to the AMEs
Right.
so that, again, an airman will walk out, providing they meet the parameters in these worksheets with their certificate.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the second point that you mentioned there is one I'd like to go back to for a minute there, because you mentioned dramatic changes at the FAA that happened 10 years ago or so with SSRIs. And I know that, the topic of mental health with pilots and in the aviation community is obviously a really important one. The percent of population that throughout the United States, probably the world, that it is on some form or could benefit from some form of medication. How that works in the throughout society is fairly readily accepted. This is an area. What are your views on what the FAA can do to continue this trend in a way that we have safe pilots, but that we are encouraging people instead of discouraging people from opening up about any challenges that they're having and seeking treatment that could help them be happier, more fulfilled individuals without running the risk of losing their licenses in the process. And obviously, I'm not talking about the extremes of people, that should never be in the cockpit. I'm talking about areas of society that I'm hoping that we can help.
So yeah, this is a topic that's very near and dear to me, and some of the things that we have to change the perception, because there's still this perception that if anybody has a diagnosis of a mental health issue of any sort, they'll never fly again, and that is simply not true. But the trick is catching it before it gets so bad that either they've made an attempt to take something that might hurt them, or they've gotten to the point where we're now talking severe depression.
Mm-hmm.
That's harder to come back from. So if we can get the word out to people that if you're having issues, go talk to somebody. it's a lot easier to stop it early on
Right.
than it is after somebody has made an attempt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um,
And I can say certainly from things I've seen, things you talk to and other pilots that you come in contact with, that of course, when we're talking about something very serious, that's a different case. But I think there is that perception that things that are, I guess we would consider more mild, seasonal affective disorder, things that are kind of
mhm.
more, that aren't at a critical level, that there's still this perception that pilots can't talk to anyone. They can't get help for anything. They can't seek any of these things or run the risk that even if they tell someone, I'm having a hard time because of a divorce or this or other issues going on in my life, the perception is don't talk about it, don't touch it. How do we get from there to somewhere that's a little healthier, that we're being talking to your preventive side that you started with of,
Yeah,
of catching people and
well,
keeping them safe?
so part of it's normalizing, right? So it is okay to feel down when you're going through a divorce. It's okay to feel down when you've had a death in the family. And getting help while it's still mild or it's a situational reaction is a whole lot better than letting it snowball.
Hmm.
And it's an education bit, and it's something that we have to do better getting the word out. And of course, we've got to make sure that people get through our system in a timely manner.
Yeah.
No, I will tell you that the really severe ones, the people that are psychotic, and we do get those on occasion. I'm not real fond of schizophrenia, not real fond of some of the bipolar disorder because they tend to take themselves off their medication. But mild to moderate depression and anxiety, who of us hasn't had that at one point or another in our lives?
Yeah.
And now that
That's
we can treat them with SSRIs and get people back up in the air, there's a process. It takes time, but go look at the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners, and a lot of it's explained there. You
okay.
can go to one of the many pilot advocacy groups. You can go to the FAA. You can go to your AME. There's a lot of avenues to go out there. If you happen to be working for an air carrier, there's peer support groups that can be very helpful. And I've even heard some whispers that they may start peer support groups, which is essentially a fellow airman or pilot that's had some training in all of this stuff and can give you advice and help when you're running into issues. Another big question I get a lot is ADD and ADHD.
Hmm.
Um, actually had an AME at Oshkosh tell me, well, how come we can't issue those? And I would, sir, attention deficit disorder? I think the last place we want somebody that might not be paying full attention is in the cockpit of an airplane. But with the understanding that occasionally the diagnosis is used a bit much. And is it really, this is just a healthy young person who's bored to death in the second grade, or do they truly have ADD and ADHD? Some people will outgrow ADD and ADHD, but we do require proof that they have done that. And it helps if they're doing well in school off the medication. It helps if they're succeeding well in life, again, without the medication. And one of the things we're actually looking at, because right now when we see one of these cases, we ask for a fair amount of neuropsychiatric or neuropsychologic testing, and that can run $3,000 to $5,000 per event. And I've tasked my behavioral science folks to see if there's a smaller group of tests that would give us the answers we need, so it wouldn't be so prohibitively expensive for young people to get into the air.
Hmm. That makes sense. It seems like a common theme throughout the qualification process and dealing with issues for aerospace medical is the idea of at what level do we trust or do the physicians involved to be making decisions versus having to go up to a national level. And that involves at what level do you say the letters or the evaluations of someone's personal physicians or treating specialists matter, At what level can we delegate, and can we have people who are AMEs who in some cases say things like you're saying, like that they would be comfortable, that they know they've spent time with this individual and evaluated an individual, versus having to go all the way to Oklahoma City and have things only evaluated at that level. How do you make that decision about what types of things we can allow to be decided at a more granular local level? And is that something you see evolving? Because that's the story I think we hear the most common theme, no matter whether it's, no matter what the medical topic is. It's, well, my personal doctor says I'm really in this case, or the specialist does, or even the AME does, but then you're back to the Oklahoma City level in many cases.
Yeah, so when we're looking for new diagnoses that we can push out, CACIs or ASIs, we look at the track record we have handling those cases within the FAA. Then we look to see if they've been causal in any major accidents, or that sort of, so if it's caused one accident, we get a little more nervous about pushing it out too far. But as science evolves, we constantly are reviewing and looking at what we're doing, because we do want to get to yes, we do want to get to the point where we have everybody who can safely fly in the air. But there is a huge difference between somebody with a condition at ground level and somebody with a condition at 8,000 feet. Mm-hmm. I actually had a cardiologist send me a letter. Well, I know he had his heart attack 2 days ago, but he's fine. I'm going, he had his heart attack 2 days ago, and you want to release him to fly? Sir, does hypoxia mean anything to you?
Right.
I'm going, are you sure you want him driving his car 2 days after a heart attack? Oh no, he'll be fine. He'll be no. So part of the education, particularly, we educate AMEs on a lot of this, but they're not, in general, board certified aerospace medicine specialists that have looked at all of the impact of taking a normal human and putting them in an abnormal environment. So pulling G's at altitude. And then how does the abnormal person react in the same environment? Because if you've got a little bit of a narrowing in a vessel and you become hypoxic, now it's bad downstream. It's really bad downstream. But, as no kidding, things are being discovered. I never would have thought 10 years ago that we would be approving insulin-dependent diabetics as first and second class airmen. I mean, we had quite the struggle getting third class early on. And there were all kinds of things they had to do in flight. They had to check their blood, before they took off and in the air and all that, and they had to have food with them, and they had to provide quarterly reports. And well, now we got this thing called a continuous glucose monitor. So we have over 100 ATP pilots back out on the line flying with these monitors. And at some point, I think in the not too distant future, if I'm dreaming, maybe just a little, we'll have an artificial pancreas that can dose insulin based on the continuous glucose monitor, and magic will occur, and they're safe completely, unless something fails, and then you have to know that there's things in place to alert them to that. So yeah, we review things routinely. We have summits that we look at specific kinds of diagnoses. Right before COVID hit, we had an oncology summit where we brought in national experts in all kinds of different cancers, colon, lung, blood, it's just a whole bunch of these things, breast cancer, brain tumors. And when I went to school, 30 years ago, when stage 3 or 4 for cancer was a death sentence, and it just isn't anymore. So we have people that are 5 years or more out from stage 4 colon cancer and lung, and they're taking these really interesting medications. And we're honestly looking at them to get them back in the air on some of these medications. So now, one interesting side effect of pushing all these out there, now the cases that come to us are really challenging on occasion. So they do take longer to review. But when you look at the overall numbers, year over year, we do about 385,000 airman medical applications. That's a mix of first, second, and third, of course. About 10% will be on a special issuance of some sort. Maybe one of the ASIs, so they don't have to come back through us every year.
Mm-hmm.
About 1% ends up in a denial, at least an initial denial. Many of those people fail to pursue, but it's less than 0.1% that are final denied. So we're talking 350 to 400.
So when you say
Final denied
final
every year.
denial, you're talking about people who have been denied and then appeal and go through the entire appeal process but don't succeed.
Right. So a final denial is essentially at my level.
Mm-hmm.
They are pretty rare. It's not nice if it's you. I get that. But when you look at the overall scheme, 95% of pilots walk out of the doctor's office with their certificate right now.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned that the entire process is based on kind of risk management, the same way insurance would look at it to some degree, and as a corollary. Do you also look at it that way in terms of the type of level that they're operating at? You mentioned the difference between a Class 3 medical or a Class 1 medical. I mean, essentially, is the risk as viewed by your office different to the world, to someone who's, just flying a Cub on the weekends and under a Class 3 medical or even basic med, versus someone who's flying behind a bunch of paying passengers that have bought a ticket and trusted the airline?
So the first class medical standards are higher. They are. Just look at vision. I expect a first class pilot to be 20/20. Mm-hmm. Corrected if necessary. Right. A third class pilot can be 20/40.
Do the same differences apply to things that we talked about, like whether it be someone who has a cardiac issue or recover or is in remission from cancer or wants to get cleared with SSRIs or something, the same concept? If they are Class 3 versus Class 1, they get treated differently?
The level of scrutiny is higher for the professional folks. And certain diagnoses, for instance, let's talk about myocardial infarctions or heart attacks. A pilot that's a first or second class airman has to wait 3 months, unless it was left main, or there's a couple other little caveats at 6 months. A third class airman, there's no mandatory wait. Now there typically is a wait on their doctor's side because of the reporting, and they may not want the individual flying like 2 days after, as I said.
Right.
But and that was actually removed as part of, or during part of the same legislation that created basic med, the waiting time for third class airmen. If you look at insulin, you can be a third class airman on insulin without a glucose monitor.
Mm-hmm. And is that something that an AME, that as an example, is that something that stops at the AME level or has to go all the way through to Oklahoma City?
Oh, the diabetes on insulin has to come to us. Mm-hmm. In fact, diabetes on most medications come to us unless it's pre-diabetes, and then there's khaki for that if you're just on metformin. But many of those can be put on an AASI.
So when you said pre-diabetes, you're talking about medication-based. They're still on medication.
There's a pre-diabetes, a hypoglycemia, or I just blanked completely on the other term for it. But some people, they're not diabetic yet, and they're put on some metformin. So there's a khaki for those people. Okay.
So I asked just for clarity, you weren't talking about people that aren't on medication that just test certain ways.
Well, so there's diet controlled. And if they're truly diet controlled, yes, the AME can handle that without us. But again, all this is in the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners.
Yeah, that's really important for people to know. Obviously, a lot of information is obviously there. Now, as you go down that chain from 1, 2, and 3, you get to the next big one, which of course a lot of people want to hear about, which are what are your views on basic med and what that has meant to aviation, and what you think, I guess, the pros, the cons, the future of that is.
So it's important to remember that in order to qualify for basic med, you've had at least one FAA medical valid for at least one day after July 14th of 2006. So the exam itself might have been done as early as July of 2003.
Mm-hmm.
That was not subsequently denied, suspended, revoked, or withdrawn. And they don't have any of the 10 conditions that require them to come back through the FAA as stipulated by the law and in 14 CFR Part 68. Now, I think it's gotten a lot of people back in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And the early studies and review of the accident data is showing no statistical difference between basic med and third class, with the caveat that it's still early. The average length of time since the last FAA medical was only 2.9 years at this point. So even though it's been on the books going on 5 years, it's still pretty new. But it's certainly very promising. The early data is showing no statistical difference. But I would encourage airmen, because close to 1/3 of the basic med pilots, their last medical was under a special issuance. So there's medical history in many of these folks that I really encourage them to continue to see their doctors on a routine basis to make sure they're taking care of their own health. So they fly a long time without having to come back through me.
Isn't that a requirement anyway? I thought of basic med that they've got to be under the care of a physician and treating through that. So I thought that's personal responsibility.
It is a personal responsibility. So yes, they do what's called a comprehensive medical examination checklist every 4 years. And we hope that they go see their treating physicians. But what the law says and what was put into Part 68 was any state licensed physician can do that. And that would include in 38 states in this country, chiropractors.
Interesting.
Yeah, because of physicians of chiropractic, depending on the state. So yeah, we really hope they go see their treating physician, somebody that's familiar with their medical history and their care. But it's not a requirement by any stretch. Then they have to do the education pieces every 2 years. And I would encourage them to make sure they keep copies in multiple places of all of these documents. Because yeah, and to include digital images, because I can't replace it for them. You know, a medical, if there was, you know, a tornado came through or a flood or the dog ate it, I can send you a new one, but I can't send you a new one of these because I don't have it. And the physicians are under no obligation to keep copies of it either.
That makes sense.
Treat that like gold. Put it somewhere safe, because you sure as heck don't want to be caught without it. But
so
no, I've had lots of people get to basic med.
So it sounds like one of the biggest differences with basic med, you mentioned there's obviously 10 disqualifying conditions that take you, it doesn't matter if you're under basic med, one of these conditions happens and you got to go back to the FAA. However, for everything else, you're able to work through your physician and under the care of your physician there, as opposed to the AME. And in some of those cases, if they were under any class of medical and they went through the AME, that would then either be, as you mentioned, these different processes of CACI or going perhaps back to Oklahoma City. And that at least helps from that perspective. So it sounds like some people are doing it who had a special issuance at one point, maybe a scare and they want to keep flying. Other people perhaps who didn't have one, that just want to be able to keep everything local as long as they're outside of those 10 big commandments.
Right, exactly. So yeah, the last numbers I saw were right at 66,000 people. Now we are seeing some people go to basic med and then come back to FAA, which is kind of curious to me. I don't know.
Maybe they want to fly bigger aircraft, go faster or go higher.
Could well be. Could well, or they, yeah. Because the rules under basic med are pretty broad.
Yeah.
Up to 6,000 pounds. I actually asked Sam Graves one day. He's the senator from Missouri. We happened to be at a Warbird conference, and I'm going, so Sam, how'd you come up with 6,000 pounds? And he looked at me and he laughed. He said, I sent my staffer down to see how much my airplane weighed.
Yeah, I think quite a few people who have looked at certain aircraft know how that one got picked.
So Sam owns the Texan, right? Which is 5,900 and some odd pounds. Yeah, 6,000. Okay.
Nice. Isn't it great how our legislation gets written? Um, so let's talk COVID for a minute, because of course that's one of the big things that has happened just before your tenure, and something that you're dealing with, of course, right now. Our own show came about specifically when COVID hit, in order to bring this community together and provide it with inspirational folks like yourself, to be able to hear your stories and get exposure to all of this. But COVID has had a major impact, obviously, on aviation, both commercial and general. In some cases even positive, if we all look at what's happened with how many people are flying general aviation now. What are you seeing from an aerospace medical perspective? There's been a lot of news about disclosure during medicals, long COVID, and things like that.
Oh, you're so right. And COVID actually taught us a bunch. So the current policy is, if an individual was treated for COVID in an intensive care unit, so they were in the ICU, they have to be deferred so that we can review some of the records in a current status report.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else can be issued except those with active disease. So they're currently infected, and we've had a couple of those go to AMEs, and it's like, why are you in the office sick? Or they've got long haul symptoms. So many of those, we've seen an increase in mental health conditions. We've seen some worsening of pulmonary conditions. There's a couple of cardiac, there's some neurologic things that we're seeing. Most of those will get to yes, but we just have to be sure that they have adequate reserves. So for instance, if they're they've got lung issues, their PFTs, pulmonary function tests, are of an adequate level that we're pretty sure they're going to oxygenate appropriately in the air. But there's a couple of really cool things that happened with COVID. And one of them, many of you may recall, we blanket extended everybody's medicals early on, 90 days. Well, actually, the initial extension was for March, April, May to the 30th of June. And I love our lawyers, but they wanted a date. And then May rolled around and it wasn't slowing down. So we went back to them and said, one, I can't put 4 months worth of exams all falling due in the AMEs in June. That would be crazy making. Way too many people trying to get appointments. And one of the reasons we did this to begin with is we wanted to keep well pilots out of doctors' offices with potentially sick people until we had the administrative and engineering solutions in place that we could reasonably expect somebody could go to their doctor and not get sick in the doctor's office. Mm-hmm. So in May, we extended everybody to a full 90 days through the exams expiring in September. And then September, so those are the people that would be good to the end of the year, essentially. And then we did another extension, and the last one ended up stopping in April, I think, of this year. And it had some interesting caveats in there. But yeah, we did that with an SFAR. We just extended everybody to include all of the special issuances, just everybody. We did the same thing with agency employed air traffic controllers, because that was just an FAA order that governs the length of those. So with a stroke of a pen, we did them. The ones that got interesting are the contract and DoD civilian controllers. Mm-hmm. We had to do them by name with an exemption to the law. So yeah, that one got real interesting. And I knew we had 3 contract controller providers. There's actually about 3 more. And then there's the DoD. But we eventually got everybody the same set of stuff. And the 3 months seems to have worked, because it took about that long for the AMEs to get comfortable. And in fact, early on, we had many AMEs just shut their offices. They just simply weren't available.
So it's an interesting opportunity with something like this. I mean, COVID has had a few things we've You know, we talked about offline, kind of like the gifts of COVID. There've been a few things of life that have changed for the better with this experiment. Now, one of them, of course, was telemedicine, for example, took a huge jump and forward progress during COVID out of necessity, probably in a way that isn't going back. Is there data, is there things that have come out of this extension that you've talked about where now you can look back and say, was there any increased risk by increasing the duration and extending people that hadn't been seen? Was there any fallout? Was there any problem? And maybe that data can be used in the future to extend time periods or change things to make them easier?
Yeah, so we're looking at that. Of course, the confounder in all of that is early on the air traffic just plummeted.
Mm.
I mean, they went to 10% of commercial, and most of that was moving cargo.
Mm.
The FAA worked very closely to certify aircraft that usually carry passengers to carry boxes.
Right.
So yeah, we're looking, but the confounders I
Yeah.
think are going to make it a bit challenging. Now the good news is, God forbid something like this happen again, we've done it. Now,
Right.
I'll be honest with you, the only reason we knew we could do the contract controllers that way is I had done it when I was a Southern Regional Flight Surgeon for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands when they had those hurricanes in 2017. So, the hurricane hits the coast in Georgia, and you can go far enough inland, you'll find somebody with power and an office open to get a medical. They couldn't.
Right.
I mean, it took us 3 weeks to find all of our employees in Puerto Rico. Had to get a helicopter to find the last one because of all the bridges that were out, and they couldn't just leave the island. So we had extended a handful of pilots by name in the congressional record that were vital to the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. So we took that to the next level with these contract controllers and DoD controllers. So we've broken the code. We'll know how to do this next time.
Right.
Another kind of cool thing, until these vaccines came out, we had never approved, at least in any of our memories, a new medication that hadn't been on the market for 12 months. And we did it within 24 hours of the EUAs.
Right. That's a big step.
So we had those, yeah, I mean, it was huge. Now there's still a 48-hour wait after you get a vaccination before you can go back to flying. And that's
Right.
because of the side effect profiles associated with these. I was hopeful when one of them got a full approval that I could back that down, but the updated documentation on side effects was actually worse than it was in the phase 3 trials.
Mm.
But,
well, it's also been obviously an opportunity to see mRNA vaccines take off that probably would never have, or not never, but would have taken a long time compared to the speed that the entire technology then became accepted.
now those actually had been in the works for years, but not fielded the way they are now.
Mm. Absolutely. That's so, getting back, of course, to your personal story a little bit here as well. I do want to point out, I think it's incredibly notable that you have the distinction of being the first woman to hold the office of Federal Air Surgeon, and that's probably shouldn't have taken, of course, that long, but it's very important, I think, to address that. And what factors do you think contribute to the low percentage of women in aviation right now, and what do you think that can start to change that as you see yourself in this role in aviation medicine?
So another one of my passions is public outreach, be it to the pilot groups. We had an aeromedical summit, certification summit, that we listened to our constituents, and we're making changes. We're taking the most threatening letters and making them so that up front, you got your waiver. You got to read the mumbo jumbo at the end, but at least you'll know, as opposed to the bottom of paragraph 2, at the top of paragraph 1, oh, I got my waiver, kind of thing. But then
So you
I
don't
look
get your first
across.
heart attack while reading the letter?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure I did more stress tests on these letters than any doctor in the country. But yeah, we don't like to do that to people. And oh, by the way, another thing that should be coming in the next 6 to 9 months is, just like you can see where your pizza is from the time you order it, you'll be able to see where your medical is in our system, which is going to be huge.
That's right.
But back to the young people. So one of the other STEM and STEAM, getting out there. there are so many kids out there that don't know that these career paths exist. No, for those of us that are active pilots going, what, they grew up under a rock? No, they just didn't have the opportunities we have. So as one of my staff members says, if they can't see it, they can't be it. And I submit to this group that high school's too late. We need to be in the middle schools. We need to be out there volunteering with youth groups. We need to be getting them interested in various programs that are out there. I mean, we are facing a lack of mechanics.
Oh yeah.
And particularly if you own old airplanes like we do, if we don't get young people interested in being mechanics, if we don't get people interested in being pilots, aerospace engineers, then we could be in real trouble because we won't be able to replace ourselves.
Right.
You know, it was fascinating. I delivered a couple of lectures 2 weeks ago at Auburn in their flight program, and I challenged each of the classes. So I did a keynote speech on Thursday evening, and then I did 2 classes in human factors on Friday morning. And I said, so how do we get young people interested? How do we get young folks out there? And they came up with some really interesting ideas. And one of them, and understand, they're in an aviation program at Auburn. And I said, well, we need to be able to get kids in light aircraft. And I said, so how many of you have heard of EAA's Young Eagle program? One of the instructors held his hand up. And I'm going, okay, folks, EAA has this program where it's sort of sweat equity, where you do so much work, you get a flight hour. You know, they did tell me, yeah, we're standing up our first EAA chapter, but there's lots of groups out there like that to get people interested. You asked me what got me interested in aviation. When I was, I guess I was a senior in college, one of my fellow cadets, Bill Chalk, I'll never forget him, was a CFII up at the Ohio State Airfield. He said, come on, Susan, we're gonna go flying. And I'll never forget going up in a Cessna the first time. And there was pretty good wind at altitude. And he said, watch this. And he slowed it down, and we were going backwards in the airplane, flying. I went, well, that's too darn cool. Now, I prefer forward momentum here, actually, but yeah, I spend as much time as I can with youth groups and out in the schools, be it as a science fair judge or teaching aviation merit badge to one of the scout groups, mentoring folks. I serve as the medical advisor on a couple of high schools, science fair boards, so the human use committee type things, because they really are our future. And of course, in my own family, my boys grew up around it, and they're both going into aviation in various aspects.
Yeah, it seems like one other area that could really use some strides in terms of increasing the percentages of women involved, quite frankly, is actually directly in the FAA's aeromedical organization. AMEs, if we look down the list, don't seem to have a very large percentage of women in there, and it's been almost self-described as kind of an old boys club in a way. And it'd be really nice to see some progress in that area as well.
And we're working with that. We are trying to get out into the medical schools and the colleges and universities. So not only through the FAA, but through the Aerospace Medicine Association, which is an even bigger network of people that can reach out. We are seeing more women. In fact, if you look at the flight surgeons in the FAA, just counting, I think there's 12 of us now.
Wow.
Which is pretty big.
And are the AA ranks overall growing? Are we creating more? It seems like for a while that was really contracting. It's kind of hard to find a medical examiner. Is that an area that's growing nationwide? Are we trying to attract people to that and add diversity to it?
Yes, we are. Certain areas are already a bit saturated, but we are trying to grow the cadre up. I mean, we used to have a standard where 1 AME for every 100 pilots. We're looking at that to see if that's the right mix. And where that came from originally was we wanted to be sure there was enough work for them to stay current so that they didn't get rusty when it comes to dealing with pilots. But then you end up with the folks that do 10 a year, and I've got some that do over 3,000. That's all they do.
Right.
But yeah, we've got some that do an incredible volume. But yeah, we're out there educating. We're out there telling people this is a possibility. If any of you have a physician that's interested remotely in flying, or as a pilot themselves, so far the IRS has been continuing to use the letters we give them so they can write 50 hours of flight time off a year. So there's some incentives there. But it goes back to getting these people at a young age interested in aviation so that they have the skill set to become an AME.
Yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense. One last medical topic that as I keep an eye on comments that have been coming in, a subject that's come in more than once would be an understatement, as the last medical one is sleep apnea. That seems to be a fairly hot topic. Any evolution in what the FAA's viewpoint is in the future of that?
Yes, so that is one of the diagnoses. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I told my folks that I need them to go research it to see if we can figure out how to make sleep apnea a CACI.
And can you redefine for everyone what a CACI means?
Conditions AMEs can issue.
Okay.
So each of these things has a worksheet that if the answers are correct, the AME can issue on the spot.
Got it.
So yeah, I've challenged them to try to make it like that. In the meantime, it is an AME assisted special issuance now.
Okay.
In certain categories.
That's good to know. I know that that's another one of those kind of topics that it seems like we're stuck in a lot of ways with perception that pilots in some cases don't want to go in and admit to it, don't want to go in and get any treatment because they feel like they'll lose their license. And so it ends up hurting everyone as being kind of like a symptom they keep to themselves.
Yeah, well, and I got to tell you, the number of people that have told me the difference in their own perception of their alertness between treatment with OSA or treatment with CPAP or BiPAP or one of the other devices compared to before they were treated. It just like, it was night and day. I'm so glad I did it kind of thing. Not everybody's that lucky, but
Absolutely.
But many people tolerate the treatment very well and respond beautifully.
Excellent. Well, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. And I have to say, I want to make sure I also direct people to your Pilot Minute broadcast. There are 2 of those out there on the YouTube channel. And I have to say personally that, yeah, sure, I stayed focused on the content, but the video that has you flying the Stearman and the look on your face certainly, it really gives you a really optimistic outlook on what the future is going to be of FAA aeromedical policy simply by your love of aviation and your connection to general aviation. I think we could use that throughout every level of the FAA. Yeah,
actually, we're going to film the next 2. We're looking at November, later this month. And the third one will be on first aid kits and survival kits.
Ooh.
So yeah, but figuring out how to put that in 90 seconds is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And the next one's going to be on sedating antihistamines. And then a shameless plug, we're starting to do in-person training at the Airman Medical or Education Division in Oklahoma City. We're figuring out how to do that again. We got a second prot, so the mixed gas thing, so we'll be able, once we're allowed to travel, be able to take that to more venues.
Wonderful.
And the last big thing, we broke ground on something called Y waves. So this is a huge pool, first of its kind in the world, that is capable of generating 10-foot waves and wind, so that you can truly get training on what it would be like to ditch at sea.
Wow. Maybe learn how to use those life preservers and inflatable jackets in the and your onboard raft if that's something that you ever needed to do.
Yeah. So yeah, there's all kinds of fun things happening in the Office of Aerospace Medicine.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much. I'll direct everyone to make sure you check out the Pilot Minute and the upcoming Pilot Minutes coming there as well. Dr. Susan Northrup, FAA's Federal Air Surgeon, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here on Social Flight Live.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
I really do appreciate it. And to everyone else, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live as well. We will be back next Tuesday, November 9th at 8 p.m. with Mike Bush talking about saving you money on your aviation maintenance. On Tuesday, November 16th, Apario President Chris Garberg will be joining us here to talk about the evolution of that company, their current products, and what's coming as well for their Stratus line of products. And then also on Tuesday, November 23rd, again at 8 p.m., Ariel Tweedo from Flying Wild Alaska will be back here on the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for Social Flight. Blue skies.